Stop guarding your heart, a Zen story on releasing your armor. Right now, you are likely carrying a cold, heavy numbness across your chest, a protective cynicism that has settled deeply into your muscles after repeated emotional letdowns. You lie awake in the dark, deliberately expecting the worst from tomorrow, simply because you cannot bear the thought of being blindsided by another broken promise. This defensive guarding feels like a practical necessity, a shield you must hold up against a world that has proven itself unpredictable and sharp. You have grown tired of being disappointed, so your mind has chosen a quiet, preemptive insulation, turning away from hope to ensure you are never caught off guard again. Yet, this constant vigilance is exhausting. Your shoulders are locked in a permanent brace, your breathing is shallow, and you are trapped behind a wall of your own making, feeling entirely isolated in the middle of the night. The space around you has gathered the deep, comforting aroma of parched barley, the smoky warmth of slow-burning cedar embers, and the dense, earthy scent of a seasoned kitchen hearth. Let your body sink directly into the firm, steady surface of the mattress, allowing the floorboards beneath you to assume the full burden of your physical frame, without demanding that you remain on guard for a single second longer. There is a quiet truth waiting for you in this dark room, an absolute assurance that your protective shell is not a defect of your character, but a natural response to a world that left you bruised. No sudden transformation will be forced upon your heart during these hours, and your spirit is not required to strip away its defenses to earn the right to rest tonight. You are allowed to inhabit this space exactly as you are, guarded or open, without any pressure to change. We often believe that our cynicism is a form of hard-won wisdom, a realistic appraisal of life that keeps us safe from future agony, but a profound, gentle insight from the lineage of the Buddha suggests a surprising paradox about the nature of our internal armor. The mind does not suffer because people are unpredictable, but because we try to thicken our outer scales to keep the cold out, forgetting that this heavy casing simultaneously traps our own natural warmth inside a narrow, freezing vault. The shield we built to protect ourselves from the arrows of the world eventually becomes the very weight that suffocates our ability to breathe. Peace arrives not when we successfully construct an impenetrable fortress, but when we realize that the open air itself carries no innate threat to our underlying stillness, and that our armor is what is turning our inner world into a cold, heavy prison. It is deeply draining to live your life as a perpetual sentry at a remote frontier station, constantly examining every gesture for an ulterior motive while your ribs absorb the cold stress of your mistrust. Right now, dear friend, you might notice a distinct, rigid tightness locked directly behind your sternum, or a subtle, cold restriction in the center of your throat. This physical shield is the direct somatic price of a mind that has been trying to protect its vulnerability by thickening its expectations, hour after hour, treating every kind word as a potential trap. Maybe you have felt this too, a heavy weariness that makes it impossible to fully receive an act of genuine kindness, because you are already searching for the hidden catch. We assume that if we can just anticipate our disappointment in the dark, we will somehow earn the immunity to rest. But keeping the buckles so tight only ensures that your own spirit is starved of the warmth it needs to survive. In a short while, our journey will lead us to a dark, soot-stained watchtower kitchen filled with the texture of rough mountain timber and boiling root broth, offering a completely fresh way to relate to this guarded life. But before we wander up to that freezing frontier ridge, let us sit softly with the immediate reality of how your body is resting right now. The anticipation of being hurt can feel like a heavy plate of polished horn resting directly over your lungs, its weight shortening your breath as you lie perfectly still under the covers. You have monitored this internal boundary for many seasons, believing that if you allowed your muscles to relax without a defense, everything you have left would be destroyed. But notice how much energy it takes to maintain that frantic grip beneath your blankets. Your chest has grown hard from the restriction, and your awareness is living on the freezing ledge of an unchosen year. Allow a long, slow expansion to open the guarded chambers of your chest, letting the warm steam of the room widen the tight spaces beneath your ribs. As you let that current pass, Notice if there is even a tiny pocket of space where your sternum can loosen completely into the mattress, letting your shoulders drop down like an unclasped breastplate. You do not have to settle the ultimate meaning of your past betrayals before the sun rises. And you do not need to find a way to trust the world to prove your readiness for sleep. The open air requires no shield to protect its underlying stillness, and the space inside your heart in this exact second is completely secure, unarmored, and free. There is no arrow flying in this dark room that requires your defense tonight, and you may let the heavy plates slide from your chest whenever you are ready. The heavy identity of being a person who must suspect every motivation is not your permanent nature, because the events that taught you that terror are completely distant, existing now only as a habit of tension inside your muscles. What you are actually carrying is your ongoing effort to maintain a fortress that was already born to be open, a quiet, internal panic that your spirit cannot survive the natural vulnerability of being alive. Every time you check an old memory to justify your current isolation, or hold your heart back from a simple conversation because it feels too risky, you add another layer of horn to a vest that was meant to remain completely soft. You are completely permitted to be tired of this constant tightening, and you may let the iron buckles hang completely loose tonight. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, letting go of the unspoken defenses and the silent protective barriers you have been planning behind your eyes for so long. Let the small muscles around your lower abdomen relax, releasing the constant, vigilant effort to keep your life from moving against a world that you cannot control. Right now, the cold frontier ridge has grown entirely dark, and the night requires no armor, your intervention, or your permission to remain completely still. You are safe enough to let the defensive machinery of your thoughts go entirely slack, if it feels right, allowing the watchtower gates to remain barred while the warm hearth smoke carries your worries up into the dark sky. The scrape of a dry horn scale against cold copper wire always echoes with a peculiar, hollow ring when the north wind drops low over the timber rafters. Long before the roads were cleared through the northern gaps, a solitary watchtower sat atop a freezing frontier ridge where the gray stone walls seemed to catch the very teeth of the mountain blizzards. In this high, soot-stained world lived a young border scout named Kale, whose leather vest was completely hidden beneath a heavy garment of his own construction. Kale possessed an extraordinarily keen eye, an ability to detect the faintest tremor in the distant brush, and a memory that retained the sting of ancient betrayals with an unyielding clarity. While the other scouts laughed around the evening fire, Kale would sit in the shadow of the woodpile, with a tight restriction locking his chest. He looked at the vast, dark forest below and felt a persistent, anticipatory dread of being ambushed by an unmapped danger. His nights were entirely dominated by a silent, protective policy, treating every human interaction as a hidden trap designed to strip away his remaining peace. This deep mistrust drove Kale to an exhausting secret labor every evening after his watch on the battlements had ended. He would retreat to his timber bunkhouse, carrying small, thick plates of polished tortoise shell horn that he traded his rations to secure from the southern merchants. To Kale, each hard scale was an absolute necessity, a small piece of predictable certainty that could insulate his skin from a world that had proven itself sharp and unkind. He would use heavy copper wire to bind these segments onto his canvas vest, overlapping them like the skin of an ancient river beast. The work required an intense, straining focus that left his neck stiff and his fingers raw from tightening the wire knots. He believed that if he could just add enough layers of horn over his vital organs, he would finally create a barrier that disappointment could never pierce. As soon as a row was fastened, Kale would apply a thick layer of boiled pine sap over the copper bindings, creating an unyielding, rigid crust. The sharp, smoky aroma of the heated resin filled the corners of the drafty room as he smoothed the edges, locking his upper body inside a dark, impenetrable shell. Over 3 long seasons, Kale thickened this breastplate until the garment stood upright on its own against the timber wall, a heavy mound of polished horn that weighed more than a full basket of river stone. Yet this growing armor brought him absolutely no internal quiet. He lived in a state of constant, Latinite hypervigilance, lying awake under his coarse wool blankets to listen for the scratch of an arrow against his shield, or worrying that a single loose wire was exposing his vulnerability to a hidden foe. The life of the garrison continued to move around his bench without his participation. The old soldiers sharing simple stories of their childhoods without any armor at all. Cale found that he could no longer listen to a comrade's offer of hot tea without an immediate, suffocating knot of suspicion tightening his throat. Nor could he look at a gesture of goodwill without searching for the underlying motive. He was so busy preparing his defense against an anticipated injury that he was never actually warm enough to enjoy the fire. His chest felt like an iron-bound gate, heavy, cold, and entirely separate from the living tissue of the mountain station. He had built an elaborate fortress of horn and sap to keep his spirit from being blindsided again. But the fortress had become a narrow cage that left him shivering behind his own rows of scales. Deep within the lowest level of the watchtower, where the foundations met the cold bedrock, lived an old guardhouse cook named Juro. He was a man of immense stillness, his face lined by decades of open steam, his hands permanently rough and gray from lifting heavy iron cauldrons and tending the open flames. He did not wear a vest of horn. He did not lock his thoughts behind a shield, and he allowed his simple wooden utensils to rest openly on the grease-stained counter, where the soot and the salt touched them freely. One midnight, when the freezing gale began to rattle the heavy oak shutters of the bunkhouse, Cale walked down the narrow stone steps into the kitchen. He wore his massive, multi-layered breastplate, every movement producing a loud metallic scrape that shattered the quiet of the passage. His shoulders were hunched forward under the immense weight, and his eyes carried the dry, desperate look of a guard who had spent months defending a collapsing wall. He sat down on a low bench near the brick hearth, his rigid armor preventing him from leaning back against the timber post. The old cook did not offer a profound philosophical lesson, and he did not criticize the heavy shell that Cale carried over his ribs. He simply continued his quiet work, his fingers holding a long, unadorned ash ladle that he used to stir a deep pot of boiling root broth. The ladle was light, simple, and entirely unpolished, its handle smoothed only by years of contact with salt water and open steam. Juro watched the white vapor rise toward the soot-blackened ceiling, then reached out and placed a second empty wooden bowl onto the table between them. He did not speak a single word. He merely dipped his light ash ladle into the boiling cauldron, filled Cale's bowl to the brim, and laid the wooden tool down on the bare boards. Cale felt an immediate, automatic wave of resistance tighten his throat as he looked at the steaming broth. His mind instantly began to question the cook's intention, wondering if some bitter herb had been added to the pot, or if this simple hospitality was a prelude to an unchosen obligation. He tried to lean forward to lift the wooden bowl, but the rigid, overlapping horn plates across his sternum dug sharply into his collarbones, his armor restricting his arms so completely that he could barely reach the table without an intense, painful strain. The old man looked at Cale's locked posture, then reached out with his bare, calloused thumb and gently tapped the thick copper wire that bound the center plate of the breastplate. The sound that returned from the armor was incredibly dull, dead, and entirely lacking in resonance, like the strike of a mallet against dry clay. Cale sat perfectly still in the orange glow of the embers, his breath shallow as he looked from the light ash ladle to the massive weight crushing his own ribs. The realization hit his mind with the clean, quiet force of the mountain air, breaking through the rigid assumptions he had carried for seasons. He saw that his frantic effort to build an impenetrable defense had not kept a single disappointment out of his life. It had only trapped his own internal warmth behind a cold, lifeless wall. He had turned his own chest into an unyielding prison out of a quiet panic that his soul could not survive the ordinary friction of the world. A deep, heavy sigh escaped his lips, a slow relaxation that allowed his shoulders to drop an inch beneath the straps. He reached back with his raw fingers, found the main copper buckle behind his shoulder blades, and unhooked the master binding with a sudden, clean release. The hollow clatter of that unbuckled horn garment sliding down against the flagstones reveals a profound truth about what takes place inside your own chest when you lie awake trying to fortify your spirit against the unknown. When we look deeply into this old story, we find that it does not ask us to become completely passive, unfeeling statues who ignore our past injuries or pretend that we have no stakes in our emotional safety. The wisdom of the Buddha was never an instruction to freeze your natural vulnerability or to treat your tender human history with a forced, artificial indifference. It is a completely different kind of invitation. A quiet realization that the genuine ache of an old wound is very different from the exhausting daily struggle of constantly weaving fresh copper cords to lock your shoulders in place. Your internal space is simply an open valley that has been subjected to occasional storms, a landscape waiting for its proper warmth. The true burden, the heavy work that keeps you from sleeping tonight, is the fierce, ongoing restriction your mind applies to that open landscape every single hour. We often live with a deep internal craving that disguises itself as an honorable journey of self-preservation. This craving is the desperate, rigid feeling in your upper back that insists you must achieve a state of absolute insulation before you can finally allow yourself to be accepted by the world or protected from harm. It is the belief that if you can just adjust the outer shield of your expectations perfectly enough, your current existence will finally be secure from betrayal and insulated from the agony of being exposed to disappointment. But when you look closely at this habit, you find that your mind has turned self-protection into a form of slow, internal confinement. You are holding on to an imaginary blueprint of a perfect, unassailable defense with such an intense grip that your own genuine present life is left completely cold, covered in the dark soot of your suspicions, because your spirit is still standing out on the freezing battlements, trying to turn a soft chest into an impenetrable wall. True presence is not about destroying your natural capacity to feel, but about developing the gentle ability to notice a hyper-vigilant thought without giving it all your strength to twist the next tightening wire. It is the simple, soft awareness that can observe a habit of mistrust arising in the mind without mistaking that specific reaction for a permanent definition of the room you inhabit. When you allow yourself to perceive an internal caution as an unadorned wooden ladle passing through a very warm broth, rather than a total collapse of your personal security, your relation to your past begins to change. The letdowns of your yesterday cannot dictate your peace tonight unless you lend them your current breath, using your limited energy to maintain a frantic tension that does not belong to the quiet room where you are resting. Consider how much more exhausting an insecurity becomes when you decide it is an active threat you must counter from your bed, rather than just an old scar that is resting in the dark. The great insight of constant change reminds us that nothing in our internal landscape is fixed, not even the deepest patterns of numbness we believe we have carved into our sense of self. Every conditioned thought is a temporary arrangement of old memories, a pattern that will naturally loosen its grip if you stop prying the bone knife beneath your ribs to keep the agitation alive. Your suffering has grown larger, not because your true nature is lacking, but because you have been using your desire for absolute immunity to add a secondary, artificial distress to a frame that was already trying to rest on its own. You have been treating an inner hearth as a permanent combat zone, acting as both the frantic sentry and the heavy cage under your own blankets. When we speak of letting go, we are not talking about a harsh act of neglect or erasing the healthy desire you feel to live with integrity and care. True release is a softening of the muscles, a gradual widening of the sternum that allows the heavy measurement tools of the mind to drop from your fingers without your constant management. It is the courage to see that the unpredictable texture of your unmapped future is not a proof of your failure, but simply the raw ground where the natural clarity of life can find its voice. By letting that constant shifting drop, you are not losing your protection. You are simply reclaiming the living tissue of the moment you are actually inhabiting. You are allowing the space inside your heart to be raw and warm, instead of using all your time to manipulate a foundation that was already trying to find its balance at its own natural dimensions. Compassion begins when you look at your own racing thoughts and realize that your spirit has already survived many heavy pressures. The ledges of your capacity are already set, they are already deep, and they have sustained you all the way to this quiet evening. without letting your core identity completely shatter on the slope. To continue chiseling those lines tonight, for failing to match an artificial design, is to force your own living mind to stand forever in the dark quarry of an unchosen year, while the rest of the world rests in the quiet. You can choose to leave the bronze plummet in the moss, allowing the uneven landscape to rest in the dark, without demanding that it prove its symmetry tonight. You can offer those old self-corrections a quiet place in the damp earth, letting the ground hold the weight naturally. In a few moments, the keeper of the hearth will show us another way to sit with the unmapped stone, where the mind must learn to stay completely still with the wet shale before the heart can ever vibrate in harmony with the mountain. But right now, let this emotional truth sink deep into the small muscles behind your eyes, down into the spaces between your hips where you have stored your oldest anxiety. You are not required to present a perfectly straight foundation to be worthy of your own kindness tonight, and you do not need to guarantee a flawless presentation to deserve a night of deep rest. The earth requires no permission to remain silent in the dark, and it does not spend its nights wishing it could turn its rugged cliffs into a smooth road to look like a temple of accomplishments. It simply holds its inner stillness, completely free of the need to shift. Let yourself rest in the quiet space that notices how tired you have become from this long dragging of your own nature. You can feel the soft texture of your current surroundings, the actual air moving across your face, the real support of the floorboards beneath your frame. These things are present and real, while the old emotional obligation is entirely unformed, existing now only as patterns of thought that cannot offer you any true shelter for the night. You are allowed to let the heavy iron crowbar rest in the quiet grass, watching the white mist of your self-monitoring settle to the ground until the whole mind becomes still and spacious, showing you nothing but your own undisturbed nature looking back at you from the dark. Let us take a quiet moment to pause right here, allowing the smoky, comforting warmth of the guardhouse kitchen to settle softly around the space where you are resting. There is absolutely no requirement to arrive at any sudden conclusion tonight, and no pressure is being placed upon your mind to complete a flawless defensive perimeter before the morning comes. If it feels right, allow your awareness to move gently toward the natural, unforced movement of your breath, just as it is occurring in this exact second. You do not need to alter its rhythm, and you do not need to make it conform to any idealized standard of perfect alignment. Simply observe the warm sensation of the air as it touches your nostrils, and follow the soft collapse of your abdomen as that breath returns to the room. With each exhalation, perhaps you might permit your upper chest, your shoulders, and your throat to sink just a fraction deeper into the surface beneath you, letting the mattress absorb the full physical reality of your frame. As you lie here in the dark, you might become aware of a specific memory of betrayal, an unchosen letdown, or a chronic habit of defensive isolation that has been circulating through your thoughts tonight. Instead of trying to push this protective urge away, or forcing yourself to stop feeling guarded, see if you can simply give it permission to be observed. You might imagine that this persistent need to insulate your heart is like a heavy plate of polished horn, held tightly across your sternum, its thick copper wires creating a subtle friction inside your awareness. There is no need to judge yourself for holding on to this protection, because it makes complete sense that you would try to secure love and safety by maintaining an unyielding presentation. Even noticing that your muscles are braced against the heavy scales is enough. A soft, compassionate recognition that requires no struggle and no sudden transformation. Perhaps you can look directly at the emotional texture of this habit, naming the pattern quietly inside your own understanding without any blame. You might whisper to yourself, softly, "This is the old habit of constant tightening." Notice where this persistent weariness is expressing itself in your physical body right now, perhaps as a dry restriction behind your collarbones, or a subtle, cold holding in the center of your throat. If it feels comfortable, imagine mentally letting that main copper buckle slide from its hook, allowing the heavy plates to drop away from your ribs without any effort from your fingers. You are not abandoning your practical responsibilities or pretending that your past injuries do not matter. You are simply giving your sternum permission to unclamp completely into the dark, letting the foundation rest without your active management. With your mind's eye, visualize that specific worry, that stiff cord of chronic hypervigilance, being received by the deep silence of the soot-stained kitchen floorboards. You do not need to twist a single strand of wire, and you do not need to force a perfect barrier. You only need to let the weight settle down into the ground. Watch as the mental image naturally begins to change at its own speed, the sharp angles of the horn plates losing their rigid definition as they blend into the soft shadow of an unadorned wooden bowl. Let the visualization move without any effort from your side, watching the wide hearth absorb the full density of your self-corrections until the room feels completely uniform and calm. There is complete safety in allowing this inner practice to dissolve into the deep quiet of the room, knowing that you can return to your practical life whenever you are ready. For right now, in this unhurried interval, your only requirement is to return to the simple physical surface of your bed. Notice the dry, clean texture of the sheets against your wrists, the warm temperature of the air touching your skin, and the steady automatic rise and fall of your chest. You do not have to finish the fortification of your soul before the dawn arrives, and you do not need to achieve a state of absolute predictability tonight. The low watchtower hearth is completely dark, the copper buckles are hanging loose on their pegs, and the uncarved boulders require no supervision from your tired thoughts as you allow your presence to sink fully into the ground beneath you. As your frame continues to relax, perhaps you can perceive how the simple presence of the light ash ladle represents an entirely different way of moving through your days. It does not carry a single plate of horn to defend itself from the boiling liquid, yet it never fractures under the intense heat of the cauldron because its fibers are completely unarmored and open. It fulfills its purpose by receiving the soup completely, allowing the current to touch its wood without trying to turn the warmth into a weapon or a permanent cage. Even noticing that your mind is trying to argue against this softness is enough. There is no need to force your thoughts to become completely compliant, or to demand that your memories of hurt disappear from your history before you can sleep. You can let your attention rest in the spacious, empty center of that wooden bowl, letting the white steam of the kitchen wash across the dry spaces of your mind. You are discovering that your true capacity is not defined by the thickness of your armor, but by the wide, receptive space that can hold both the cold mountain wind and the warm hearth fire without breaking. By allowing the scales to slide into the shadows, you are reclaiming the living tissue of the moment you are actually inhabiting, letting the space inside your chest be raw and warm, instead of using all your time to manipulate a shield that was already trying to find its rest. The watchtower requires no further vigilance from your tired thoughts tonight, and you are entirely safe to let your breath move on its own natural path. The high-altitude winter arrived with a sharp, blinding clarity that left the pine needles coated in thin layers of frost, making the long mountain paths crackle like parchment under the foot. Cale spent his mornings inside the dark guardhouse kitchen, watching the cold mist pass effortlessly through the gaps in the timber siding without trying to block the draft with his old armor rags. The old guardhouse cook, Juro, sat across from him near a pile of unadorned wooden bowls that had completely lost their fresh luster, turning a deep, smoky gray color under the cold light. He did not offer Cale a special technique to repair the broken wire knots of his discarded breastplate, and he did not promise that the frontier station would remain free from the bite of the coming seasons. He simply picked up his long ash ladle, held it near the low embers of the brick hearth, and began to skim the bubbling surface of a deep cauldron filled with parched barley and hot water. On an evening when the northern gale began to rattle the heavy oak shutters, a young outpost sentry from the lower watchtower arrived at the kitchen door, carrying word that a senior officer who had once deeply betrayed Cale's trust had been assigned to take command of the ridge before the final freeze. Cale felt an immediate, massive wave of dry heat constrict the very center of his chest, an instinctive, automatic urge to run back to his timber bunkhouse, to grab his copper wires, and to frantically bind the heavy tortoise-shell horn plates back over his ribs before the new commander arrived. His mind quickly constructed a terrifying, loud scenario that if he failed to establish an absolute defense, he would be completely crushed by a second betrayal, leaving him with no dignity or protection on the mountain. The internal compulsion to resist the upcoming confrontation was vibrating through his wrists like a tightened string, tempting him to lock his spirit behind a wall of permanent numbness. Then, he looked across the brick hearth at the old cook, who was continuing to guide the light ash ladle through the boiling soup, his movements remaining entirely unhurried, despite the tension vibrating through the room. Juro did not tell him to disregard his genuine anger, and he did not offer an artificial phrase to pretend the past injury had not occurred. He simply paused and looked down at the empty wooden bowl on the table. Kale took a single, long breath of the smoky air, noticing the absolute stillness of the heavy timber walls outside, and intentionally chose to remain sitting upon his low bench, instead of rushing out into the cold to rebuild his armor. Instead of forcing his hands to twist the copper cords once again, he reached down and placed his bare palm directly against the smooth, unpolished surface of the table, allowing his fingertips to feel the raw grain of the wood. He sat with the suffocating knot of his mistrust for several long minutes, letting his chest rise and fall against the sharp ache of the memory, while his racing thoughts tried to convince him that his lack of armor was an act of total vulnerability. He realized that the light ash ladle was strong precisely because it did not carry a single horn scale to defend its position. It survived the boiling cauldron by remaining completely open to the heat without trying to fight the current. He saw that his long habit of treating every person as an active enemy had not altered a single event in his history. It had only made his current existence feel like a permanent imprisonment behind his own lines. He reached out his hand, lifted his spoon, and quietly began to help the old cook skim the ash from the edge of the hearth, watching the embers glow without letting the sparks ignite his old defensive panic. A quiet, spacious realization began to settle into the small muscles right behind his sternum, softening the tight restriction that had locked his breathing since the sentry arrived. He recognized that the deepest suffering he carried was not caused by the officer's return, but by his own persistent habit of treating every suspicious thought as an absolute truth that had to be obeyed immediately. He had been turning his own heart into a cold bunker, using his constant anticipation of disappointment as a shield, while destroying the quiet peace of the raw nature he already possessed. He looked down at his bare palms, noticing that they were no longer gripping the heavy tortoise-shell plates. They were simply open, receiving the warm temperature of the kitchen without any need to defend a border or force a rigid finish upon the night. He did not try to fix his remaining fear, and he did not pretend that the past betrayal had not caused a deep, lasting ache inside his chest. He held his position on the bench until the midnight hour arrived, allowing the uncertainty of the tomorrow to exist in the room without trying to build a fortress against it. He rose from his seat, walked to the dark corner where his heavy-plated vest lay against the timber wall, and picked up the largest horn scale that had fallen onto the floorboards. He did not break the piece in anger, and he did not make a dramatic declaration to the garrison. He simply laid the flat segment near the salt bin to be used as a simple scraper for the hearth, leaving the copper wires completely slack under the low rafters. The old cook looked out at the dark forest through the small window, then handed Kale a clean piece of linen cloth to wipe the soot from his wrists, his gesture carrying the deep, silent weight of the mountain itself. Kale sat back down by the low embers, his skin still tender, his heart still vulnerable, and his mind still whispering that he might encounter another broken promise on the path ahead. But this time, before his collarbones could lock into their old defensive posture, he paused, took a deep breath of the wood smoke, and allowed the unarmored spaces of his chest to remain completely soft. In the dark, he had not become a magically fearless soldier in a single evening, but the phantom need to perpetually thicken his scales had lost its grip, leaving nothing but the real warm space of the kitchen, looking back at him from the wood. Let this quiet transformation sink down into your own awareness as you lie perfectly still under your blankets tonight, recognizing that your spirit can survive the open air without a single wire to hold it together. You can feel the steady support of the mattress beneath your shoulders, a solid plane that requires no armor and no walls to keep you from falling into the dark. The memories of the people who hurt you cannot cross the threshold of this room unless you choose to spend your resting hours weaving fresh defenses to keep them out. You are completely permitted to leave the watchtower gates unbarred for the remainder of the night, allowing the old expectations to dissolve into the silence until your whole chest becomes wide, warm, and spacious. The small, lingering anxieties that move through your thoughts are nothing more than distant gusts of wind rattling the outer shingles of the station. They cannot touch the underlying stillness of the hearth unless you give them your hands to build a new cage. You can let the upcoming challenges exist without your active management, watching the white steam of your breath settle into the room until the mind becomes completely at ease with its own vulnerability. You are not required to present a perfect, unassailable fortress to be worthy of rest tonight, and you do not need to guarantee an absolute protection to deserve a night of deep, uninterrupted sleep. The mountain requires no shields to hold its position in the freezing blizzard. It simply remains still, completely free of the need to defend its shape. The deliberate act of laying that single horn plate near the salt bin reveals an incredible transformation in how we can treat our internal processing of vulnerability during these quiet midnight hours. When we dissect the hidden engine of our late-night panic, we constantly find that we are treating our lives like an endangered outpost, trying to wrap every passing interaction in thick, protective layers of cynical prediction so that we never have to face the sudden wind of a new disappointment. We live with an unspoken, heavy dread of what will happen if our current emotional borders dissolve, leaving our hands empty and our hearts unmoored. This anticipatory grief drives us to endlessly project our worries forward, or continuously replay our past injuries beneath the blankets, as if our mental vigilance could somehow force the unpredictable world to harden into a permanent shield before the morning comes. We believe that if we can just anticipate every possible betrayal with enough intensity, we will finally earn the right to exist without fear. When you look closely at this habit of constant tightening, you can see how easily the mind turns its natural fear of being hurt into a permanent form of identity. You begin to define your very essence not as a living soul who is simply navigating a very complex, unwritten journey, but as a person whose baseline security is fundamentally fragile, because you cannot guarantee the absolute loyalty of those around you. We try to correct this perceived emotional deficiency by using intense self-reproach and shame as our primary motivators, falsely believing that if we judge our current fears harshly enough, we will eventually force ourselves to become strong enough to withstand the cold. But self-judgment is a thick, yellow crust that cannot bring any true stability to your core. It only keeps your attention locked onto the imaginary ruins of your own making. You become so accustomed to the familiar, tight band vibrating across your collarbones that you begin to mistake that constant, draining vigilance for your actual name. The core insight of Buddhist wisdom draws a very sharp, very merciful distinction between the raw conditions that life naturally delivers and the extra suffering our mind constructs through its own desperate attempts at insulation. Your journey through this world will always present you with certain cold seasons, sudden situational changes, moments of unmapped emptiness, and intervals where your path feels entirely swept away by a sudden betrayal. This initial reality is like the crisp wind of the high ridge touching an exposed face, a clean, inevitable friction that is simply a part of possessing an authentic, growing human life. But the mind, in its terror of losing what it cherishes, immediately transforms that single cold night into an endless emergency. We add an immense secondary burden of stress by demanding that our circumstances should remain completely stationary, or by convincing ourselves that we must completely exhaust our current vitality to lock an unripened season against the frost. Imagine a high mountain river that carries pieces of sharp, jagged ice down through its channels during the deep winter thaw, letting the frozen fragments strike against the mossy banks with a loud ringing impact. The riverbed survives the cold seasons precisely because its waters remain fluid, allowing the frozen blocks to slide effortlessly through the pool. and move toward the lower valley without blocking the current. But if a frantic scout becomes terrified that the impact of the ice will scar the rock and break the structure of the channel, and he begins to throw heavy boulders and thick timber beams into the stream to block the chunks from passing, his desperate effort only creates a massive choke dam that causes the entire pool to freeze solid. He ruins the natural clarity of the river not because his hands are malicious, but because his intense refusal to let the ice pass creates a stagnant pressure that bursts his own walls. The initial cold was never an enemy to the stream. Your rigid, hypervigilant manipulation of the flow is what creates the breaking tension that disrupts your rest tonight. True peace does not mean that the unwritten chapters of your career, your relationships, or your health will suddenly display a permanent blueprint upon your wall, or that the world will completely change its rules to guarantee you a life without any difficult encounters. Liberation arrives when you finally change your relationship with vulnerability itself, allowing the vast container of your present awareness to hold the unpredictable hours without letting that movement pull your physical body out of its natural alignment. You stop treating every anxious projection as a solid, undeniable reality that must be resolved from your mattress before you are permitted to close your eyes. When you notice a sharp, tight loop of suspicion arising behind your ribs, you can perceive it as nothing more than a single patch of smoke moving across a very broad frontier valley, a temporary cloud that will naturally spend its density if you simply keep your fingers loose. By letting go of the need to remain a permanent sentry over an unmanifested future, you are not committing an act of neglect against your practical life. You are simply recognizing that true security develops its strength deep within the flow, entirely out of sight, and no amount of midnight tightening can assist the wood in finding its path through the fire. This internal transformation is incredibly subtle. It does not require a dramatic breakthrough or a complete rewriting of your practical goals. It is as simple as taking one single unhurried breath before you follow an old habit of self-reproach, noticing the familiar pull in your throat, and deciding to let the copper buckles of your mind remain entirely unhooked for the remainder of the evening. You are giving your spirit permission to inhabit the actual sanctuary where your spine is resting right now, instead of running back to the freezing ledges of an unchosen year. In a short while, we will explore how this deep kitchen wisdom can be carried out of the watchtower and into the specific daily patterns of your modern life. But for right now, let yourself sit with the immense relief that comes when you realize you do not have to finish the preservation of your entire family history tonight. The world is turning without your supervision. The uncounted stars are holding their positions in the dark, and your value as a living soul requires no validation from a harvest that was never meant to remain frozen in the dark. You are entirely permitted to let the muscles of your abdomen become soft and spacious, watching the old habits of prediction lose their grip until there is nothing left to hold on to but the simple, solid reality of this present hour. Let your awareness notice how the habit of self-judgment acts exactly like a layer of dry, hardened resin lining the inside of your ribs. We try to use this rigid casing to keep our feelings from shifting, believing that if we can create an absolute boundary against the unknown, our inner world will remain perfectly pristine and untouched by grief. But the more we pack our true nature into these artificial compartments, the more we cut ourselves off from the natural warmth of the present moment. We become terrified of our own vulnerability, treating a single moment of sadness or uncertainty as a sign that our entire structure is collapsing into ruin. We forget that a living heart is meant to expand and contract, to feel the full texture of the passing seasons without becoming brittle or cold. When we allow ourselves to look at our anxiety through the simple clarity of the guardhouse cook, we see that true durability comes from being pliable, not from being locked behind scales. The unadorned ash ladle can form a beautiful protective channel, precisely because it does not resist the heat of the cauldron. It allows its grain to absorb the warm broth without splitting under the pressure of the storm. It holds the weight of the mountain winter not by fighting the gravity of the earth, but by distributing the pressure evenly across its open, unarmored space. Your spirit is fully capable of this same flexible endurance tonight. You do not need to turn your heart into a cold bunker to survive the transitions of your life. You can allow your awareness to become like that light wooden bowl, letting the warmth of the passing hours move through your center without leaving a single trace of damage behind. Let the tight grip in your lower belly dissolve completely into the supportive surface beneath you, feeling how the mattress receives the full weight of your frame, without asking for a single proof of your permanence. You do not have to settle the ultimate meaning of your changes before your eyes close, and you do not need to find a way to shield your loved ones from the natural movement of time before the sun rises. The frontier ridge is completely dark, the wild rosemary is resting in the damp soil, and the great canopy of the night is turning its uncounted stars without a single effort from your mind. You are completely permitted to let your boundaries go slack, watching the old habits of preservation lose their density until there is nothing left but the quiet, rhythmic expansion of your breath, holding you safe in the dark. This kitchen clarity is never meant to stay locked away within the dry soot of a mountain frontier workshop. It belongs directly in the middle of your modern, glass-paneled afternoons. We carry our unchosen armor cords into crowded train cars, down brightly lit store aisles, and right into the tight silence that follows a sudden phone notification. Think of those specific moments during your week when you find your hand reaching out to tap a dark screen, checking over and over for some sign of reassurance or validation from an external source. In that small, high-tension interval, your inner life is acting exactly like an anxious sentry in a dim room, frantically tightening copper wires to make sure your progress does not show a single day of weakness to the world. You are treating an unanswered message or an unreturned email like a major gap in your defensive wall, using up your precious current energy to force an immediate response from a landscape that may not even be settled. Consider how often you walk through your daily routines with an artificial expression of ease pinned to your features, while your deeper self is dragging a whole pile of unwritten worry through the office corridors. You pretend to have everything sorted because you worry that if anyone glimpses the raw grain on your knuckles, they will see that you are no longer executing the traditional confident posture your background demanded of you. We watch the beautifully filtered lives of our peers on social platforms, comparing our hidden, unformed pages with their visible scrolls, instantly assuming that our own timeline is lagging behind a standard we never actually chose to carry. You feel an intense, crushing guilt whenever you try to sit loosely in a chair or lie down early on your mattress, believing that your physical rest is a privilege you are only allowed to purchase after every single future threat has been fully countered. But this mountain cook's wisdom offers an incredibly practical way to step away from the tools without needing to overturn your entire external environment. You can begin to express a quiet, spacious discipline right in the center of your kitchen or your desk, long before the sun goes down. When an old pattern of cynicism flashes across your awareness during a tense conversation, or when a sudden fear of the future tightens your stomach, you can choose to introduce a brief, unhurried pause before your voice leaps out to defend itself. This pause is a deliberate unbuckling of the chest, a moment where you look at the rigidity in your back and realize that this thought is just a passing cloud of smoke drifting through a wide valley. It does not mean your whole life is collapsing into ruin. You are choosing not to give your living hands to an old automated defense mechanism, allowing the light ash ladle of your mind to float quietly on the current without your active management. You can hold a profound, beautiful devotion for the people who share your life without turning that care into a tight, strangling grip that tries to force their movements into a shape that feels safe to your anxiety. When we try to force a partner, a child, or a friend to match our internal map, we are simply trying to drop our own heavy horn plates across their natural growth, an exhausting manipulation that leaves both people feeling raw and confined. True love acts more like that warm, soot-stained hearth room on the ridge, remaining broad and steady, allowing the other person to develop at their own natural pace while you stay anchored in your own quiet depth. You do not need to wire their branches to make your own existence valid. because your capacity for awareness is already vast enough to contain whatever seasons move through the room. Allow your mind to absorb the liberating truth that you do not need to earn your right to lie perfectly still on this bed, and your worth as a living being is not dependent on how much of your future fortress you manage to force into place today. You can let your bones become heavy right now, simply because the dark has arrived and the floorboards beneath your room are entirely ready to sustain your weight without asking for a single proof of your invulnerability. You can let the unmapped paths go completely dark tonight, understanding that the only current that contains any genuine warmth, any real texture, or any real breath is the one passing through your lungs in this precise second. The tomorrow you are rehearsing is just an empty valley your anxiety is carving from dry soil, a pattern that carries no actual substance unless you choose to pull it over your chest before the day has even dawning. When you notice your attention creeping forward to predict an old disappointment or mourn a betrayal you did not prevent, you can gently hold the movement without a single trace of anger or self-reproach. You might smile at how deeply your conditioning wants to protect you by dragging you back to the freezing battlements, and you can offer that anxious habit a moment of soft validation. You can say to your own heart, the heavy scales have already been left near the hearth. The workspace is empty, and there is absolutely no debt left to pay in the middle of the night. Let the simple texture of the present environment settle into your awareness, noticing how the quietness of the hour fits perfectly around your frame. You do not need to resolve the dilemmas of your career or balance the ledger of your relationships before your eyes close. The dark air moving through the room requires no explanations from you, and it carries no memory of the errors you believe you made during the daylight hours. You are allowed to be an unfinished piece of work tonight, a living presence that is completely at ease with its own mysteries. The copper bindings have found their rest, the valley outposts are silent, and the space right beneath your lower spine is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. You can allow your consciousness to unhook itself from the need to be right, or the need to have the final word in an internal argument that has been running through your head since dinner. When we insist on winning these silent debates in the dark, we are merely polishing the edges of our horn plates, trying to make our armor look brilliant so that no one can see how cold we have become underneath. You can let the argument remain completely unresolved, letting the words drop onto the floorboards like loose scrap wire that has no use in a room meant for sleeping. The people who misunderstood you are completely distant now, and your defense is no longer required to keep your true essence safe from their judgment. Let your ribs expand into the vast, quiet space of the mattress, feeling the organic warmth of your own center rising up to replace the cold density of the metal bindings you dropped. You are discovering that your life does not need to be a continuous combat mission against an unformed future. It can be a simple, light journey that flows around the obstacles just like the mountain stream. Every long breath you take is a clean release of the extra suffering you have been layering on top of your history, a gentle return to the unadorned simplicity of your own being. You are safe here, you are unguided, and you are entirely free to let the watchman's fire burn down to cold ash while you sink into the deep, restorative dark. The cold frontier ridge has grown entirely dark now, and the heavy gale that rattled the timber shingles has dissolved into the deep, quiet warmth of the kitchen hearth. Let the language itself begin to loosen its grain, softening its pace until every single syllable lands like soft ash settling onto the unadorned stone floorboards. Your physical form is becoming immense and heavy, sinking down through the supportive layers of the bed as the gentle warmth of the room settles across the front of your body. The long winter guard over your internal perimeter has ended for the night, and the heavy horn plates have been left completely undisturbed in the deep shadows, far below the surface of your awareness. The unyielding copper bindings are still, and your fingers have forgotten the permanent curl around the tight wire knots. Listen to the quiet automatic expansion of your abdomen, a soft wave of movement that requires no diagrams, no structural blueprints, and no checking from your intellect. With each long exhalation, The center of your sternum softens completely, letting go of the residual self-correction that has lived behind your collarbones since your earliest disappointment. You are drifting back into the broad, unmapped space of your true nature, a clear, open landscape that is entirely capable of holding its own stillness without your active management. The rigid lines of your defensive planning have dissolved into the dark hearth smoke, leaving nothing but the simple, unhurried density of your body resting against the mattress. There is no longer any temporary wall to build before the light returns, and no old scar is asking to be armored in the quiet of this hour. The unadorned wooden ladle is resting quietly near the kettle, undisturbed, unmarked, and completely whole in its simple surrender to the current. Let your eyelids become twice as heavy as before, closing out the memory of the lower watchtower, closing out the search for a motive that was never meant to define your capacity for peace. You are granted full permission to leave your inner gates unmanaged tonight, to let the defensive machinery go entirely slack, without trying to settle a single account with your history. The valleys are sleeping perfectly well without your surveillance. The dark is cradling your shoulders without a single condition, and you are allowed to slip quietly beneath the weight of your self-protection. Allow your spirit to sink into the vast, undisturbed vacancy of a heart that has nothing left to defend. What if the raw warmth of your unarmored chest was always deep enough to survive the mountain freeze, without a single scale to keep the wind away? The echo of that question ripples softly through the deep recesses of your mind, losing its sharpness as it sinks into the cool, silent timber of the watchtower floorboards. There is no need to answer it. No need to construct an explanation, and no need to carry its meaning into the hours of your rest. The vast, unmapped space within you knows exactly how to hold this stillness without your active guidance. You can feel the physical reality of your frame growing heavier and more anchored with each passing second, as if the mattress beneath you were absorbing the very last traces of the day's friction. The lower spine continues to flatten, the shoulders part a fraction more in the dark, and the base of your skull rests completely soft, free from the weight of all the protections that were never meant to be wired into your skin. Let the quiet, warm moisture of the kitchen hearth filter down through your throat, soothing the small muscles that have spent hours tightly guarding your internal boundaries. You are no longer standing on the high ramparts, and you are no longer responsible for ensuring that the garrison understands the exact dimensions of your presentation. The young sentry has departed, the old cook has extinguished the logs, and the entire frontier station has been given over to the absolute, unconditional peace of the midnight hours. The timber bench requires no further preparation. The dark smoke has settled back into the earth, and the raw horn plates are resting near the salt bin, completely untouched by the anxieties of the day. Consider the immense patience of the deep valley stone, how it receives the winter snow and the summer heat without ever needing to defend its shape or explain its patterns to the mountain. It does not wish to be covered in square lines, and it does not view its uneven ridges as a defect or a sign of incompletion. It simply stands in the dark, allowing the frost to form and the shadows to lengthen, holding its structure precisely because it does not resist the space it inhabits. Your awareness is allowed to be exactly like that quiet terrace tonight, a wide, receptive sanctuary that can house the memory of your old self-corrections without letting those memories dictate the rhythm of your breath. You are not erased by the silences you have chosen. You are simply returning to the uncarved depth that has always sustained your life. The faint, lingering thoughts of the afternoon are nothing more than small flecks of ash drifting lazily through the cool air of the workspace, catching a brief glint of the dying embers before settling invisibly onto the floorboards. There is no requirement to reach out your hands to catch them, and there is no need to trace their paths back to the interactions that made you feel out of alignment. An unheld thought carries no weight in this room, and it has no power to tighten the muscles of your neck or restrict the flow of the air, unless you choose to pick up the heavy copper wire again. You can let them pass through the darkness of your awareness, watching them dissolve into the broad, quiet spaces of the ridge without giving them your current energy to keep the irritation alive. You are entering an interval where the pressure of time has completely faded away, and the frantic timelines of your daily routine have dissolved like mist over the mountain stream. The house around you is completely still, wrapped in a protective, heavy blanket of shadow that requires absolutely no monitoring or supervision from your tired thoughts. Your consciousness is drifting back to its original home, to the uncarved, spacious clarity that existed long before you ever learned to fear judgment or treat your own internal shape as an emergency. This original baseline has never been altered by the criticisms you received. It has never been diminished by the alignments that never came, and it is waiting right here, breathing softly beneath the surface of your frame. Allow yourself to drop completely into that soft velvet depth now, releasing the names of your defects, releasing the plans for tomorrow's validation, and letting go of the very need to hold an image of yourself together for the world tonight. The bed is supporting your spine with an absolute, unquestioning strength. The darkness is shielding you from the demands of the day, and your breath is moving through your body like a slow, unhurried tide on a completely silent shore. You can lay down the ledger of your self-improvement entirely, letting the vessel of your sleep drift out into the calm, open spaces where there are no arguments to perfect and no destinations you need to reach before the morning breaks. Every channel in your stomach is clear. Every old restriction has been smoothed by the quiet, and your tired soul is finally permitted to sleep, resting whole, undisturbed, and beautifully complete in the deep current of this single living moment. The darkness deepens its hold around your shoulders, expanding into the spaces between each breath, as if the entire world has stepped back to give your mind a spacious arena to completely dissolve its worries. You do not have to carry the weight of who you were during the daylight hours, or prepare a defense for the tasks that will wait for you when the sun returns to the station. The anticipation that wound through your forehead has found its level in the wide plains of your sleep, and all the heavy text your anxiety gathered along the trail has naturally dropped away, leaving the surface of your awareness perfectly clear and still. You are no longer navigating. You are no longer guarding an unpolished inner chamber. You are simply resting on the bank of the life you have survived. Let the weight of your eyelids double in their heaviness, releasing the very last trace of focus, letting the darkness behind your eyes become a soft, warm blanket that envelopes your thoughts. You can feel the quiet rhythm of the room, a gentle rise and fall that matches the unhurried expansion of your chest. The breath comes in as a quiet gift from the night air, cool and unburdened, and it flows out like a wide valley opening into the vastness of an unmapped ocean where there are no storms to face. There are no walls to maintain here, no polishing tools to watch, and no debts to pay to the future. The measurement cords of the old guard duty have been uncoiled so completely that your pelvis can finally rest flat against the support beneath you, sinking down into absolute peace. The small, lingering ripples of prediction that occasionally cross your awareness are no longer demands that you must obey. They are merely distant sounds, like the faint crackle of a cooling ember in a deep fireplace, echoing softly and then dissolving back into the absolute silence of the timber walls. You can watch them appear and disappear without reaching out your hands to catch them, knowing that an unheld thought has no power to pull you out of the sanctuary of this room. The mind has finally grown tired of its own long defensive game, and it is ready to let the iron tools rest at the bottom of the quiet workshop dust. You are entering a deep, restorative sleep where time has no numbers and the future has no shape. The watchtower is peaceful, the great mountain ridges are silent, and the space right beneath your lower back is holding you with an absolute, unconditional strength that requires no effort from your mind to maintain. Every single thing you have ever anticipated has rested its arms. Every hollow chamber is clear, and your tired soul is finally allowed to sleep, peaceful, whole, and completely free in the deep current of this single living moment.